They called her Night Shift Nellie, and the fourth-floor nurses thought it was hilarious. That was the point. Dr. Thornton had orchestrated the first overhead page at 11:56 p.m. on a Tuesday, his voice crackling through every speaker in Sacred Heart's East Wing with performative casualness. Night Shift Nellie to the supply closet, stat. The staff had laughed. A few residents smiled. Elena Martinez had simply looked up from the patient monitor, her expression flat as concrete, and continued charting without acknowledgement. Thornton had waited for something, a flinch, a flush, some visible fracture in her composure. Nothing came. Just that cold, level stare and the sound of her pen moving across the paper with mechanical precision. He didn't understand it. Didn't understand her. She moved through Sacred Heart's trauma bays like a ghost with a purpose, her hand scarred with white lines that had nothing to do with fur sticks or needle sticks. Those scars told a different story, one of field medicine under conditions most doctors only read about in journals they never quite believed. The scar spoke of survival. Of competence forged in places where incompetence meant funerals. Elena had been at Sacred Heart for 3 years, and in that time she'd earned the respect of every trauma surgeon except one. The patients loved her, the way she explained things without condescension, the way her hands moved like they already knew what needed to happen before her brain caught up. The residents asked for her by name. The attendings deferred to her triage decisions without question. And Dr. Thornton watched all of it with the expression of a man watching someone live in a house that should have been his. She arrived for the night shift at 6:58 p.m., 3 minutes before the clock formally demanded it. Her scrubs were deep blue, practical, pressed with military creases. Beneath them, visible only when she bent to check a patient's fur line, hung a single dog tag on a broken chain. The chain was silver once, now tarnished to the color of old rain. The tag itself bore no visible inscription from this distance, just the weight of something that mattered. Elena touched it unconsciously when she moved between beds, her fingers finding the cold metal against her collarbone the way other people found rosaries or wedding rings. The gesture took half a second. No one saw it. Or rather, no one understood what they were seeing. The ER that night held the controlled chaos that preceded full disaster. A 34-year-old man lay in Trauma Bay 3 with acute myocardial infarction, his chest pain radiating down his left arm in waves that made him grip the bed rails hard enough to turn his knuckles white. The on-call cardiologist was 14 minutes out. The resident, a third-year named Morrison, stood at the bedside with the expression of someone watching a problem he wasn't quite equipped to solve. Elena approached with the kind of calm that came from having made worse decisions under worse circumstances. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no apology in it. 12 lead EKG. Stat. Morrison moved. Not because she'd yelled or wielded authority she didn't technically possess, but because her certainty created a vacuum that demanded to be filled. That was the thing about Elena Martinez, she didn't ask permission to be competent. The EKG technician appeared within 30 seconds, her machine wheels squeaking against the linoleum as she moved it into position. Elena was already talking, her words clipped and precise, STEMI pattern. Likely LAD occlusion. Call cath lab. Tell them we're prepping now, not when they feel like showing up. She didn't raise her voice. The word simply arrived with the weight of absolute fact. Morrison was already drawing up the troponin panel. A nurse, Jenny, someone Elena had trained on intubation protocols, was establishing a second full line with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been watching Elena work and learning. The patient's monitor showed the telltale ST elevation, the enemy flag of cardiac arrest waving from the screen. Pressure was 168/92 and climbing. Time was a ticking bomb with numbers instead of a countdown. Elena moved with her hands first, her mind following in perfect coordination, the two operating as a single system. Her fingers checked the patient's radial pulse, strong, bounding, too fast. She was already talking to him, her voice dropping to that register that bypassed panic. We're taking you to the cath lab. They're opening now. You're going to feel better very soon. Not a promise of survival. Not a lie. Just a statement of the next right action, delivered with the tone of someone who'd stated harder truths to people facing worse odds. The patient nodded. His breathing slowed. Her presence had somehow recalibrated his nervous system, the way a skilled musician can tune an instrument just by being in the room with it. Dr. Thornton stood at the nurse's station, watching this choreography unfold. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, a styrofoam cup with a stain the color of rust. He was 46 years old, board-certified in emergency medicine, with 3 published papers on trauma protocols and a mother-in-law who'd endowed a children's wing. He had credentials. He had letters after his name. He had authority written into his title like a patent on his competence. And yet, he watched Elena Martinez, who was just a nurse according to the official taxonomy of institutional hierarchy, make the cath lab team jump like she had kernels in her phone. Watched her coordinate 5 people with 4 words and a glance. Watched the patient's vitals stabilize not because of any medication she'd administered but because the sheer fact of her presence had convinced his sympathetic nervous system to stop firing like a machine gun. It made something in Thornton's chest win tighter. Like a clock spring being twisted past its tolerance. He knew her file, everyone did. 3 years at Sacred Heart, hired straight through the nursing program at Florida State. No graduate degree. No specialization certification. No Ivy League background or wealthy family waiting in the hospital lobby. Just some woman who'd walked in off the street with scrub experience and the kind of command presence that grew on trees if you believed the fairy tales. Except it didn't grow on trees. It came from somewhere. It came from having the kind of hands that had touched things most people never touched, made decisions most people never made. He could see it in the way she moved, economical, certain, absent the tentative gestures of someone who was still learning what confidence felt like. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass. The antiseptic smell of the ER, that sharp, chemical burn that existed in every hospital on the planet, was particularly thick tonight, cutting through the copper undertone of blood and the acrid smell of fear sweat. Elena moved to the supply cart and began gathering the medications they'd need, vials organized with the kind of precision that suggested her hands had already performed this task 1,000 times. Aspirin, 325 milligrams. Clopidogrel, 600 milligrams. Heparin with a bolus calculation that she did in her head faster than Morrison could input it into the pharmacy system. She worked with her jaw set, her shoulders loose, the physical posture of someone who'd learned long ago that tension made your hands shake and shaking hands saved nobody. The dog tag moved against her collarbone as she bent and straightened, the broken chain catching the fluorescent light. Just a piece of metal on a broken cord. Nothing. Something. The cath lab called down at 7:19 p.m. Patient was ready. The transport team arrived with a stretcher that looked like something from a spacecraft, all rails and monitors and attachments for every possible emergency within an emergency. Elena briefed them, BP now 154/88, heart rate 112, troponin pending but pattern is classic. She did this while moving the patient's fur bag from the bedside hook to the portable stand, her movements allowing the transport team to work without having to ask for anything. Anticipation disguised as nursing. The patient grabbed her wrist as they wheeled him past. "You're good at this," he said, his face grey-white but his eyes clear. Elena nodded once. "You're going to be fine," she said. Not because she knew the future, but because she'd made it her current job to ensure it was possible. The stretcher wheel squeaked away. The trauma bay went quiet. That was when Thornton made his move. That was when the overhead speaker crackled to life with his voice, calm and cordial and edged with something that sounded almost like amusement. "Night shift Nellie, could you report to the pharmacy? We need your assistance." The staff in the ER froze. Morrison's face went red. Jenny's jaw tightened. Elena was standing at the supply cart, her hands mid-motion on a box of sterile gauze. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She finished placing the gauze where it belonged, took a breath that nobody but her could hear, and moved toward the pharmacy without acknowledgement. Her expression remained precisely what it had been, flat, focused, absent of anything Thornton could read as pain or humiliation. But that was the thing about Elena Martinez, she understood something that Thornton had never learned. She understood that silence was a weapon he couldn't defend against. That the most devastating response to mockery was to continue being exactly who she was, unmoved and immovable. The pages would continue. Thornton had already tasted the power of it, the way the staff's laughter validated his authority, the way Elena's non-reaction somehow validated him even more, confirmed his narrative that she was beneath notice, beneath the dignity of explanation. What he didn't know was that every single nurse and resident on that floor now understood exactly what was happening and exactly whose measure he was taking. What he didn't know was that compassion in a hospital created loyalty that credentials could never purchase. What he didn't know was that Elena Martinez had stood in Coincidental Valley with mortars falling close enough that the concussions knocked the breath out of her lungs, and that a man with a printed nameplate and a title meant nothing compared to that. The ER hummed its mechanical hum. The night shift had 14 more hours to go. And somewhere in the distance, almost imperceptible beneath the sound of monitors and voices and the endless choreography of the hospital, was the beginning of the sound that would eventually drown out everything else, the distant thump of helicopter rotors, carrying the first of what would become the story that mattered. The night shift had 14 more hours to go, and Thornton was waiting. Elena didn't see him at first. She was pulling inventory in the supply closet, counting medication vials against the log, when he blocked the doorway. The fluorescent strips above cast him in harsh white, and his shadow fell across her like a blade. "We have a discrepancy," he said. Elena turned slowly. Her hands were steady. She waited. 17 entries in the narcotics log. All with your signature. All irregular patterns. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The space shrank. Antiseptic and bleach cut through the air. Morphine, fentanyl, propofol. Missing doses that don't match the disposal protocols. "I document every medication I administer," Elena said. Her voice came out flat. "Empty. Do you?" Thornton moved closer. "Because the numbers suggest otherwise. I could report this to the DEA. I could call the state licensing board right now. Your career ends today, Martinez. Your nursing license gone. Criminal investigation. All it takes is one phone call." Elena set down the vial she was holding. The glass made no sound against the shelf. "But I'm feeling generous," Thornton continued. His voice had taken on that silken quality, the sound of a man holding power like a knife. "Stay out of my trauma bays. Stop acting like you're something you're not. Stop commanding staff like you earned that right. Stick to intake and discharge. Prove you understand your place in this hospital's hierarchy." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. "And maybe, I forget this whole situation ever happened." 2 seconds passed. 3. Elena turned to face him fully. Her jaw was set like stone, and her eyes were the color of water over cold concrete. When she spoke, her voice dropped half an octave. "The difference between us, Doctor, is that I've held beating hearts in my hands and made decisions that mattered." She stepped forward. He stepped back. "I've done it in the dark. In the sand. When the closest hospital was hours away by helicopter, and every second was the difference between someone going home and someone going home in a flag-draped box." Thornton's face flushed crimson. "You came to this hospital," Elena continued, "and saw someone who didn't fit your hierarchy. That frightens you. So you're building a case. Recording things that never happened. Creating patterns where none exist." She walked past him toward the door. "That tells me everything I need to know about your confidence in your own competence." The door closed behind her. Thornton stood alone in the supply closet, his triumph curdling in his mouth like sour milk. His hands were trembling. Hers weren't. But he wasn't finished. Not even close. The next move came 3 days later, and it was built on something more dangerous than rage. It was built on strategy. Thornton began constructing a documentation trail, careful, methodical, airtight. He started carrying a leather notebook, recording times and incidents. He documented Elena checking a medication without a witness present. He noted a patient transfer she'd coordinated without calling a resident first. He flagged a minor deviation in her charting of a blood pressure reading. Nothing spectacular. Nothing prosecutable on its own. But threaded together like a noose, the pattern emerged: recklessness, overreach, insubordination. He filed the first incident report with hospital administration on a Wednesday morning. But before that, before the paperwork became official, he wanted to break her publicly. He wanted her to feel it. He wanted the entire hospital to understand what happened when someone challenged his authority. The shift change happened at 7 in the morning. 20 staff members arriving for day shift. Fresh faces. Families to support. Mortgage payments waiting at home. Elena stood near the ambulance bay, finishing her report from a stable patient transfer, when Thornton's voice carried across the parking lot like a siren. Elena Martinez. She turned. Every head turned with her. Effective immediately, Thornton said, his voice pitched to carry, "You are stripped of all trauma bay privileges. Your pattern of dangerous overstepping has become unacceptable to this hospital standards." He was 10 yards away, surrounded by arriving staff. The rain from the night had left puddles that reflected his face like fractured mirrors. "You will handle intake and discharge only. No critical assessments. No autonomous procedures. You will wait for physician authorization before moving a patient." The arriving nurses stopped moving. Shoes on wet concrete. Someone's badge clicker jangling against her belt. The morning air smelled like ozone and the electrical charge before a storm. Elena stared at Thornton. Not through him. At him. Her expression didn't change. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply existed, still and cold, the way water becomes ice, not by moving, but by refusing to. "Do you understand?" Thornton asked, and there was something desperate in his eyes now, something that needed her to break, to cry, to crumble so he could point and say, "Look, this proves I was right." Elena nodded once. Then she turned and walked toward the hospital entrance, her pace neither hurried nor slow. Behind her, the whispers erupted like a flock of startled birds. "Did you hear what he? Stripped of privileges. Never seen him do that before." One voice, sharper than the rest, "That's not fair." Elena didn't turn around. She kept walking. The automatic doors slid open and swallowed her whole, and somewhere behind her Thornton stood in the parking lot, waiting for the satisfaction that never came. His triumph had curdled before it was born. What happened next changed the geometry of everything. The trauma alert came in at 7:43 a.m., construction accident, downtown site collapse, 7 workers with crushing injuries, all incoming simultaneously. The ER transformed in seconds from quiet morning efficiency to controlled chaos. The doors exploded open and the first stretcher arrived with a man whose legs were crushed beneath a falling beam, the bones caved in like broken coral. His screaming cut through the static of 100 voices. Elena moved. She didn't think about privileges or documentation trails or parking lot humiliations. She moved the way breath moves, the way a reflex moves, without conscious permission. She triaged the first patient with eyes, hands, motion. Crushed legs, still bleeding, bone fragments visible through the skin. Femoral artery intact. Manageable. Second position. The next patient arrived and Elena assessed before the stretcher stopped rolling, head trauma, GCS of 8, pupils blown, intracranial bleeding. Priority 1 after exsanguination. She pointed and 3 residents scrambled. Third patient, fourth, her hands moved like instruments, her eyes reading the architecture of injuries the way a musician reads sheet music. And then the 5th patient. He was conscious, fighting the stretcher, his chest heaving. Visible asymmetry, left side expanded more than right. Respiratory distress worsening with each breath. Trachea deviating toward the unaffected side. The classic presentation burned itself into her vision like a photograph taken at 3 a.m. Tension pneumothorax. The lungs collapsing inward, the pressure building, the heart being compressed millimeter by millimeter with each breath. In 3 minutes the patient's blood pressure would plummet. In 4 minutes his heart would arrest. Thornton was at the trauma bay entrance, clipboard in hand, documenting, recording, building his case. His eyes met Elena's for half a second, and she saw the calculation there, the hope that she would overstep, that she would do something beyond her scope so he could point and say, "I knew it." The on-call surgeon was 15 minutes out. Maybe 16. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 84%. Then 81. His lips were turning blue. His eyes had the distant quality that came just before consciousness slipped. Elena's right hand moved to her sternum, underneath her scrubs, touching the cold metal of the broken dog tag, the reminder of all the decisions she'd made in Coincidental Valley, where the nearest hospital was 6 hours away by Chinook helicopter and where she'd become someone entirely different. In Sanjin Valley she'd performed needle decompression on injured teammates in the dark, by feel alone, with nothing but training and muscle memory and the knowledge that hesitation meant death. But here she was just a nurse. She pulled the necessary supplies. A 14-gauge angiocath. Antiseptic wipe. The anatomy playing itself out in her mind like muscle memory made manifest. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. That exact point where the compressed lung and trapped air lived, waiting for release. Thornton's eyes widened. He understood immediately what she was about to do. The patient gasped. A sound like a drowning man finding air. "I need some jello," Elena heard herself think, dry and distant, from somewhere that wasn't this moment. "If I survive this, I'm going to find the jello and I'm going to sit and eat it until someone fires me again." 12 minutes until the surgeon arrived. She didn't have 12 minutes. 7 workers came through the ER doors at 10:41 p.m., all of them broken in different ways. 2 with crushing injuries to the legs. 1 with a compound fracture and exposed bone. 2 more bleeding from head trauma. And 1 whose chest looked wrong, that subtle asymmetry that made Elena's hands move before her brain finished the calculation. The ER descended into controlled chaos. Overhead pages crackled. Trauma bays filled. The attending physician moved between patients with the speed of someone trying to manage the unmanageable, and somewhere in the fluorescent glare and rubber glove snapping, Elena understood that the surgeon was still 12 minutes out. 12 minutes she didn't have. She moved through the space like current finding its path, reading vitals without needing to ask, understanding the hierarchy of dying without consulting a chart. The first worker needed orthopedic intervention, bad, but survivable if the bleeding stayed controlled. The second was holding steady. The third was talking through his confusion, which meant his brain was still getting oxygen. The fourth could wait. But the fifth one, the one they'd wheeled into Bay 3 with his shirt already cut away, showed something Elena had seen before in places where there were no surgeons for 50 miles. The left side of his chest rose and fell, while the right side stayed locked. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the lung, pushing the heart toward failure. The on-call surgeon was 15 minutes out now. Maybe 14. Elena had held this calculation in her hands before, in a military field hospital 2,000 miles away, where the waiting cost lives and the only option was to move. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check the chain of command. She moved to Bay 3, and her hands already knew what they needed: a 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol prep, the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line. The patient's eyes found hers, panic, then something that might have been recognition, the way drowning people recognize rescue. Elena's jaw set like stone. Her voice dropped to a register that belonged in a bunker, not a hospital. "Breathe through it. You're going to hear air escape. That's the point." The needle went in. Not hesitant. Not careful. Precise. The kind of precision that comes from muscle memory, from 1,000 field drills where the alternative to speed was watching someone's heart stop. The angle was exactly right, the depth calibrated by hands that had done this when the ground was shaking and the air smelled like diesel and copper. The hiss came immediately, that specific sound of tension releasing, of physics correcting, of air escaping the space where it didn't belong. The sound of a man getting a second chance. The patient gasped. Not a small breath. A real one. His ribs expanded on both sides now, the asymmetry gone, oxygen saturation climbing on the monitor, 68, 74, 82, 88. Stable. The room held its breath while Elena's hands moved automatically to secondary tasks, checking lung sounds with a stethoscope, verifying breath sounds where there had been silence moments before. Around her, staff stared. 2 nurses. A respiratory therapist. A tech. They stared the way people stare when they've just watched someone move like muscle memory made flesh, when they've seen a procedure performed with the precision of an operating theater instead of an ER bay. The patient gasped again, longer this time, pulling oxygen into both lungs for the first time in however long the pneumothorax had been building. His eyes cleared. His hand reached out and grabbed Elena's wrist, not in panic but in gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Elena gave a single nod and moved to the next patient without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without breaking stride. That was the difference between someone who needed praise and someone who'd spent 18 years in places where the only reward was that everyone went home breathing. The attending physician appeared at her shoulder, surprised and relieved. That was textbook. Exactly the right call. His voice carried genuine appreciation, the relief of a man who'd watched a crisis resolve instead of spiral. Elena didn't respond. She was already running through the remaining patients, vitals, hemorrhage control, cervical spine considerations, what could wait and what couldn't. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment when everything changed. Dr. Thornton stood at the edge of Bay 3, just outside the circle of nurses and monitors and beeping machines. He'd watched the entire procedure. Elena felt his presence the way an animal feels a predator, a shift in air pressure, a weight of attention. His face had gone the color of old concrete. Not shocked. Not amazed. Calculating. His pen was already out. He was already writing. Not notes about the patient's condition. Notes about Elena. A documentation trail. A pattern. Ammunition. The next 2 hours moved in the rhythm of crisis management. The surgeon arrived and reviewed Elena's work, nodding approval, running his own assessments, coordinating with orthopedics and trauma for the remaining patients. The workers stabilized. Blood pressure held. Oxygen stayed up. By midnight, all 7 were stabilized or moved to surgery with clear handoff information. By 12:15 a.m., the chaos had transformed into the controlled bustle of an ER that had done its job right. Patients were safe. Procedures had been performed with precision. Lives had been saved. Elena stood at the medication cart, documenting her triage decisions with the care of someone who understood that paperwork was its own kind of battlefield. That's when she noticed them, the incident reports Thornton had begun filing. One complaint about Elena. Then another. A notation about unauthorized invasive procedure. A reference to Hospital Policy Code 3.7.2, something about scope of practice and hierarchical authorization. The documentation wasn't wrong. Elena had performed the needle decompression without waiting for the attending physician to approve. Technically, protocol required authorization. Technically, she'd overstepped. Legally, she'd saved a life that would have flatlined in 12 minutes. Thornton moved through the ER with papers in hand, speaking to administrators who'd come down in response to the multi-patient trauma. Elena watched him point to her, watched his lips move, watched his documentation being reviewed by people in suits who didn't understand the difference between protocol and triage. He was building something. Not a moment. A pattern. He was creating the narrative where her competence became her crime, where her precision was reframed as recklessness, where the nurse who'd saved a man's life became the nurse who'd violated hospital policy and endangered a patient through unauthorized action. At 1:38 a.m., security appeared at Elena's station. 2 of them. One she recognized, a man named Clayton who'd worked nights for 3 years and knew perfectly well that Elena had never given him trouble. His face carried the discomfort of someone being asked to do something he didn't believe in. "Ms. Martinez, we need you to come with us to administration." Elena didn't ask questions. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood, removed her badge, and placed it on the counter with the kind of finality that made Clayton wince. She knew what was coming. She'd already felt the shift in the air, the way hospitals turned on people who violated the chain of command, no matter the outcome. The walk through the corridors felt like a funeral procession, other nurses watching in confusion or acknowledgement, some appearing relieved, as if they'd been waiting for permission to see Elena as a problem instead of a peer. The termination letter cited dangerous overreach of scope and pattern of insubordination. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, irrefutable. By 2 a.m., Elena stood in the parking lot holding a cardboard box containing a cracked mug, a dying succulent plant, and a photograph of her SEAL team from another lifetime, younger faces, desert backgrounds, the weight of service visible in their eyes. The rain came down like applause on the asphalt. She stared at the contents of the box as if looking for answers in the wreckage of her careful, quiet life. 2 years. She'd spent 2 years rebuilding her identity as a nurse, creating distance from the call sign and the operations and the weight of command. 2 years of deliberately being smaller, quieter, less. 2 years of proving she could belong in this world without the uniform or the rank or the memories of Coincidental Valley. And Thornton had erased it in a single documentation trail. The rain mixed with something else on her face as she stood at the bus stop, watching the hospital lights blur through the wet darkness. She had no idea what was about to arrive. No idea that her deliberate anonymity, her carefully constructed silence, had already been noted by someone who had his own loyalty codes. Someone who understood the difference between protocol and survival. Someone who'd been watching. By the time security handed Elena the cardboard box, her hands were already steady. The termination letter was printed on hospital letterhead, signed by 3 administrators she'd never met, citing dangerous overreach of scope and pattern of insubordination. The words sat there like accusations from a courtroom she'd never entered. The guard, the same one who'd walked past her 1,000 times during night shifts, met her eyes with something like apology and said nothing. His silence was worse than words. The box was light. That was the cruelest part. 3 years of night shifts, of learning every staff member's name, of staying late to train new nurses, and it all fit in something designed for a ream of paper and a stapler. She looked down at what remained of her tenure. A cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," gift from a resident 2 years ago. A dying succulent with brown-tipped leaves curling inward like surrendering hands. And beneath those, a photograph, edges worn soft from being held too many times. 8 faces in desert camouflage, all of them squinting into Coincidental Valley sunlight. 3 of those faces no longer existed in any timeline except her memory. 2 hours later, Elena stood at the bus stop 6 blocks from Sacred Heart, rain hammering down like applause for something she couldn't name. The cardboard box was balanced on her hip, already starting to soften and tear at the corners. Her scrubs clung to her skin, soaked through. Another car passed, splashing through a puddle that drenched her from waist to ankle. She didn't flinch. The water was just water. Cold was just information. Pain was data, she'd learned that long before she ever wore the white coat. She pulled out the photograph, careful not to let the rain take it completely. 8 SEAL operators from Charlie Platoon, Bravo Company, taken on a rooftop in Jalabad before the Helmand deployment. Marcus Chen on the left, dead in 2018, IED near Sanjin. Thomas Reeves in the center back, shot through the chest in 2019 while covering a civilian casualty evacuation. And there, second from the right, that was her. Younger face. Same eyes. The call sign Shadow 6 stenciled onto her gear in white letters, each one a responsibility she'd carried like a loaded weapon. The dog tag hung beneath her scrubs, cold metal against her collarbone. The chain had broken 3 years ago when she pulled it off at the enlistment office, ready to become someone new. She'd tied it back together with paracord, wrapped it tight, and never let it catch light. A reminder. A warning. A confession she kept locked beneath layers of cotton and wool, and the careful construction of Elena Martinez, the competent night shift nurse who asked no questions and expected no credit. But that Elena was gone. Thornton had killed her as surely as he'd documented her competence into a termination case. The administration had watched it happen and done nothing. And she'd let him, because the alternative was walking away from healing entirely, and she'd spent too long running already. The rain tasted like salt. Some of it was the sky. Some of it wasn't. She stared at the photograph, at Marcus's smile, at Thomas's confident posture, at the 7 others who'd made it home in flags, and wondered if she'd ever stop losing the things that mattered. The military had taken them. She'd left to find something quieter. Sacred Heart was supposed to be that. Supposed to be the place where saving lives didn't come with body counts and congressional briefings and classified operations in valleys that didn't exist on most maps. Instead, it had taken her the same way Korengal Valley had. Just slower. Just dressed up in policy violations and documentation trails instead of bullets. A bus pulled up, diesel exhaust mixing with rain and asphalt heat. The door hissed open. The driver glanced at her, soaking wet, holding a disintegrating cardboard box, standing completely motionless in the downpour like she was waiting for something to hit her. He didn't ask. He just waited. She didn't move. Not yet. In 3 weeks, her phone would ring. A voice would say, Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Patricia Hayes from Sacred Heart's Executive Board. In 3 weeks, someone would pull her military file. Someone would see what was hidden beneath the broken dog tag and the dying succulent and the cracked mug. Someone would decide that what happened to her mattered more than what Thornton had built. But right now, standing at the bus stop with the rain coming down like a judgment, Elena couldn't see 3 weeks ahead. She could only see the photograph in her hands, the faces of operators she'd kept breathing through firefights in valleys that the United States military had officially denied existing. She'd left them to find peace. Instead, she'd found a man named Thornton who'd studied the art of institutional cruelty with the precision of a surgeon, and she'd let him use her competence against her until it cost everything. The bus driver made a soft sound, a question without words. Elena looked up. Looked at the open door. Looked at her reflection in the bus window, a woman in wet scrubs holding a box that was falling apart, dog tag visible now where it had slipped from her neckline. For the first time that day, for the first time since security had handed her the termination letter, she allowed herself to think about what came after this. Not 3 weeks. Not reinstatement. Just the next moment, and the one after that, and the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could be was someone who'd already survived everything. The rain kept falling. It mixed with something on her face that wasn't the sky. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and stepped onto the bus. The doors hissed shut behind her. And in that moment, in that sealed metal box moving through Jacksonville's rain-soaked streets, Elena Martinez was finally, completely alone with the choice she'd made when she first saw Thornton's face in that parking lot, the choice to keep bleeding quietly until the right person finally asked what was really happening. 3 weeks of silence would follow. 3 weeks of per diem shifts and retail pharmacy work and applications to other hospitals where Thornton's calls had already preceded her. 3 weeks of a dog tag beneath every uniform, a photograph she studied every night, and the understanding that some things you lose in service to the greater good, and some things are stolen from you by people who've never understood what serving actually costs. But the rain knew. The rain had always known. And it kept falling on Sacred Heart's parking lot, on the spot where Thornton had stood in triumph, washing away nothing because some things don't get washed away. They just get carried forward, like medals in a box, like a broken chain holding something precious that won't break no matter how many times someone tries. 3 weeks of rain. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of Elena Martinez watching the parking lot of Sacred Heart fade in her rearview mirror each morning as she took the bus to jobs that paid minimum wage and asked nothing of her except to show up and disappear. The cardboard box sat in her apartment, untouched. The dog tag beneath her collar had become heavier somehow, though the weight was the same as it had always been. Then the phone rang at 9:08 p.m. on a Tuesday. Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Rebecca Chen, Chief of Staff at Sacred Heart. The voice was crisp, official, carrying the cadence of someone who made difficult decisions for a living. We've received an anonymous tip regarding your termination. the hospital board has completed a comprehensive review of your personnel file, your medical credentials, and your performance record during your employment with us. We've also spoken with several nurses who came forward with additional context regarding Dr. Thornton's management practices. A pause. Elena could hear the hum of fluorescent lights through the phone. Your termination was handled improperly. We'd like to offer you reinstatement, effective immediately, as our new trauma attending physician, with full credentials and authority over all trauma bay protocols. The position reports directly to me. Can you be here by 6 a.m. tomorrow? Elena's hand pressed against her chest, fingers finding the dog tag beneath her scrubs. She didn't speak for 2 full seconds. I'll be there. The night shift began at 6:15 a.m. with Elena in trauma bay attire she'd forgotten she'd packed, clinical authority restored like muscle memory, her movements carrying the precision of someone who'd made it through worse. The bay was quiet, that dangerous quiet that came before the chaos. She was reviewing trauma protocols at 6:48 a.m. when the radio crackled. Sacred Heart, we have an incoming. Navy SEAL, single casualty, trauma alert. Collapsed lung, multiple shrapnel wounds, vitals unstable. ETA for minutes. The team assembled. Elena positioned herself at the head of the bay, her hands already moving through the muscle memory of preparation. Then the ambulance doors burst open and the SEAL was on the stretcher, his chest rising unevenly, the classic asymmetrical breathing pattern of a pneumothorax, his oxygen saturation already dropping. But what caught her attention was his eyes. Even through the pain, even with his lung collapsing, he was scanning the room. Looking. Searching. Elena stepped forward. The SEAL's gaze locked on hers and something shifted in his face. His eyes widened. His breath, what he could manage of it, came faster. He lifted his hand, weak but deliberate, pointing directly at her. Shadow 6, he whispered. The words came out breathless, fractured. You're Shadow 6. The room froze. Elena's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible reaction to someone speaking her call sign aloud in a civilian trauma bay. Commander Elena Martinez. Shadow 6. That name belonged to a different life, a different uniform, a different set of scars. The attending team looked confused. The SEAL's eyes never left hers, recognition burning through his pain. Then the doors slammed open and Dr. Thornton strode in, his presence carrying the false authority of a man who'd never actually held a life in his hands. What is this? His voice cracked with something close to panic. Why is a fired nurse? He stopped. Looked at Elena. Then at the SEAL. His face began to pale. She is not authorized. She is not touching this patient. Remove her from my trauma bay immediately. This is my case. My patient. My responsibility. Elena didn't move. Her hands had already positioned the chest tube kit. Second intercostal space, she said to the respiratory tech, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd done this procedure in conditions that would make a civilian surgeon weep. Midclavicular line. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Move. The commands weren't requests. They were the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed because lives depended on it. I said no. Thornton grabbed her arm. Step back, or I'm calling security. The SEAL's teammate stood up from the corner where he'd been supporting his brother. He was still in combat fatigues, dust still on his boots from wherever they'd been when the IED went off, and he moved with a kind of controlled violence that made the room temperature drop 10 degrees. Doctor, he said. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage. I need you to hear something. He pulled out a worn document, official seal visible, and began to read. Commander Elena Martinez, Navy Cross for Valor under fire in Coincidental Valley, 2012. Silver Star for sustained leadership under enemy engagement. 3 Purple Hearts. Operational Commander for all SEAL medical team protocols in Helmand Province. Trained more combat surgeons than any other officer in the Naval Special Operations community. That ring a bell. Thornton's face drained of all color. His hand fell away from Elena's arm. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. Just the sound of his breathing, ragged and shallow, like a man watching his entire career collapse in real time. Elena was already moving. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that distinctive sound of pressure releasing, of a lung beginning to re-expand. She taped the catheter, positioned a chest tube kit, worked with movements so precise they looked like choreography. The SEAL's oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, stable. She looked at him once. You're going to be fine, petty officer. Thank you, Commander, he whispered. Thornton stood frozen in the corner, watching everything he'd built over 3 years of calculated cruelty dissolve in the time it took to read a single citation. By afternoon, the hospital board had convened an emergency session. By evening, the investigation into his actions had accelerated past a formal review into something that looked like an eviction. Nurses had come forward, the medication discrepancies were fabricated, the policy violations taken grotesquely out of context, the entire documentation trail a monument to obsessive vindictiveness. The SEAL's teammate had filed a formal complaint with the Navy Liaison Office. Thornton's surgical privileges were suspended pending investigation. At 4:32 p.m., the same security guard who'd walked Elena out 3 weeks ago appeared at the trauma bay doors, holding an identical cardboard box. He approached Dr. Thornton with the kind of expression that suggested he'd been waiting a long time for this moment. Dr. Thornton, he said, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone delivering justice wrapped in professionalism. I believe you know the way out, sir. Your new assignment is waiting in the loading dock. The Rural Clinic Network starts you Monday as a medical supply van driver. They're expecting you by 7 a.m. The guard smiled, not unkindly, just truthfully. I believe you know the way to the parking lot. Thornton picked up the box like a man in a funeral. Staff watched him leave with the kind of silence that follows a public execution. No one said goodbye. Elena didn't see him go. She was in surgery, working alongside the attending trauma surgeon, her hands moving with the kind of certainty that came from having sutured up bleeding vessels in the backseat of a helicopter at 10,000 feet. The SEAL's collapsed lung was repaired, tissue approximated with precision, the kind of surgical poetry that came from a commander who'd trained to save lives under conditions that most surgeons would consider impossible. The job was clean. The job was done. The job felt like coming home. 6 months later, Elena heard through hospital gossip that Thornton was driving his medical supply van between rural clinics in the Florida Panhandle, delivering bandages and catheters and syringes to places too small for trauma bays or surgeons or parking lots where someone's career could be destroyed in front of an arriving shift. She felt absolutely nothing about it, not satisfaction, not vindication, just the steady weight of her dog tag against her chest as she sutured a child's forehead in the ER. The child had fallen off a bike 2 blocks from the hospital, terrified and bleeding, and Elena worked with the kind of gentle precision that made the fear drain away. She murmured reassurance. She showed the child what she was doing. She explained each stitch like a story. This was why she'd left the Navy. Not for recognition or medals or the weight of command, but for moments like this, healing instead of triaging, peace instead of chaos, the privilege of giving someone their life back without anyone needing to know the cost of what you'd already given. The SEAL stopped by before his discharge, moving slowly but moving, his lung repaired and his chest wound healing into a scar that would join all the others. Thank you, Commander, he said. Elena shook her head. Just Elena now. And you're welcome. He nodded with the kind of understanding that only comes from someone who's actually left a uniform behind and discovered that the real battle is learning how to live without it. The night shift began. Elena tied her hair back, touched her dog tag once, and walked toward the next patient. The hospital hummed around her, the ventilator rhythms, the monitor beeps, the rubber gloves snapping, the footsteps on tile that sounded like 1,000 small battles being won. She'd found her place. She'd found her purpose. And somewhere on an empty road in North Florida, a man was learning that there were consequences to picking a fight with someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.